I don't
I don't
know.
know. I don't feel like I'm looking at you. Am I looking in the wrong place? If I look at the camera, I feel like I'm not looking at your face, so it's kind of bizarre.
I think if you look like right at the face of the person, that
Right.
works.
Okay.
I'm always tempted to look at myself and see what I look like while I'm talking. Like, oh,
Oh, I didn't think of that. Yeah. I did check out the back of my room and I was like, I probably should have picked a better corner, but this is where my desk is, so I'm not moving.
no, that's fine. I've gotten
Eight
really good
penguins.
at having a wife who lives in Canada. This is how we communicate.
Oh, that's
So
cool.
yeah, so I've
Okay,
gotten
so since I can edit the video, now we're broadcasting live. So I saw it and I immediately thought of you when I saw the post because we talked about the festival last year
yeah.
because you'd had an amazing experience. So how many times have you actually gone?
I've gone 14 times in 15 years. So I missed one festival the year that I moved to Portland, Maine from Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Because you're in the middle of moving.
I had just moved. I was totally broke. I had just started a new job and it just wasn't in the cards. But what I learned from that experience was that I was grieving most of that week from not being in that space. And I made a commitment to attend every year, no matter what, since then. So I came out as a result of attending the festival. I came out as a lesbian. The festival is actually where I learned about transgender issues for the first time, um, and which was amazing and remarkable and life changing. And it's also where I met my wife 4 years ago. So it has a lot of meaning to me personally and politically.
Yeah, I was just talking to a friend here who hadn't heard about the controversy and said that for her, the first times that she went, specifically the very first time, like it was the body thing that was a big deal to her, like to all of a sudden see all of the types and possibility of women's bodies that, you don't even become aware of the fact that you only ever see people in magazines, you see models, you see strippers, people who do sex work, but you don't see all of the great variety of bodies.
Yeah.
Um, and she said that was the mind-blowing thing to her, and the sort of the natural range of gender variance, whether it was in terms of curviness or straightness or hairiness or whatever, that was so much more apparent in that space. And for her, it was, yeah, same as many people describe it, that kind of life-changing experience where it was like really actually seeing um, the actual variety of human beings as opposed to this kind of artificial commercial version. That makes, I guess,
Makes a lot of
I think
sense.
we see women, right? It's commercial, so.
Right, right. It is amazing to see women, and for me, festival has always been about just being able to feel seen, and feel accepted and feel really safe in that. I was saying to someone that I always feel so safe expressing my full feminine self at Michigan because I know that people are truly seeing me for who I am, queer, smart woman, not just someone seeking femininity for male gaze, or seeking male gaze with my femininity, rather. So that's always really powerful to me. And I love the different gender expressions that happen at festival. There's a wide range of gender expressions, and seeing the generations that encompass those expressions is really remarkable too. So the older women who have been there since the start of the festival are very they're very special to me, and I honor them and their lived experience every year that I'm there, even when we disagree.
Yeah, it was interesting, even though you don't agree with them. So what was your initial take on this statement? Because I feel like I read it and I had 18 different thoughts even while I was reading it, where I was like, I have to go back and look at some of these statements more carefully. But I know what my gut reaction is. I want to know what yours was first, though.
My gut reaction was that it's closer, but that we're still not there. So I think that statements like this sometimes only muddy the waters even more. I think that until we hear that the festival believes that trans women are women-born women and included in the intention of the festival and welcome in the space, it's not going to be clear. So that was my first gut reaction, was that it's still not fully clear to me. But the other thing that I was very thankful for was Lisa Vogel's leadership in saying that trans women are women and that they need to be respected and treated as such. They're just not women born female, so to speak. And so I appreciated her reiterating that, though, because many of the women who disagree with inclusion of trans women will say really transphobic and awful things, and they'll misgender trans women, which is really upsetting to me. And I feel that we're better than that, regardless of how we feel about inclusion at the festival. We really need to be better than that.
Right. It's. I feel like it's still like in a sort of separate but equal place in some ways. It's like trans women are women. You know, I know that's loaded language, but it's like trans women are women, but not the same kind of women. And so, and of course, you know, I mean, I feel like one of the things that comes up all the time with this argument is sort of, I always want to go back to this, the whole idea of intersectionality. It's like, well, we did kind of already deconstruct this idea that this one biological experience of womanness is so not consistent, right, across anything, gender, ability, you know, whatever it is, race, class, all of these things. And so this still kind of essentializing of there is this woman, born woman, I can't even say that phrase, raised in a way,
yeah,
you know, that has something significant to do with anyone's experience of being a woman in the world, where I'm sort of far more interested in sort of, you know, how women experience oppression in the world, whether they are, no matter what kind of women they are. And so I'm still not, I don't understand why there's this insistence still on kind of a biological, I mean, that's what it is, right? It's a
right.
biological essentialism, is that unless you're actually born female in the world. But trans women, you know, are oppressed starting at birth too.
Yeah.
It's not in the same specific way, perhaps. I say the only difference for me is maybe, you know, the choice of, you know, the sheer number of abortions that are committed, right, against girl fetuses. That's one thing. And so you would, but the reality is trans men would be caught up in that. So the idea that that's the only place that I can necessarily think of where whether or not you're born with a vagina has anything to do with the experience of being a woman. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to think about being a woman who wasn't born and assigned female at birth with a vagina. I mean, because that's my lived experience, right? So sometimes my womanhood feels very tied to my biology. Other times it does not. So, you know, that when I think about being a woman and expressing my womanhood, it's very rarely about my body. Until recently, I mean, my partner and I are talking about starting a family, and I would really love to be pregnant. I'd love to have that experience. And so I've been thinking a lot about my womanhood in terms of my physical body. And I feel blessed to have this physical body that can do these things. So I like talking about that, and I've never felt that anyone is trying to erase that. I've never felt that when I've been in conversation and community with trans women that they don't want me to talk about my womanhood in terms of my physical body, if that's real for me. So I don't feel the same sort of fears that if we welcome trans women with open arms to the festival, that will go away, that some of us won't be allowed to talk about what womanhood means to us, because it might not mean the same thing to another woman, because we already do that, right? Like the way that I'm a woman is very different from the way my wife is a woman. I feel comfortable when someone labels me or when I talk about myself as being cisgender. My wife does not, because she's so butch and so visibly gender variant in the world that term doesn't work for her lived experience. So it's so interesting, you know, the way that her and I are women. She would not want to carry a child. I would want to carry a child. So the way she talks about her body is almost non-existent. She doesn't really talk about her body in terms of her womanhood as much as I talk about my body in terms of mine. So I think that womanhood means a lot more than just our physical bodies or what we were assigned at birth. And I'm very aware of trans youth and the resources that they have available to them. And having worked with some trans youth here in Maine, I'm very clear that these children are growing up experiencing girlhoods and womanhood in a way that a trans woman who maybe came out in her 20s or 30s didn't. So
Right.
even within trans women, I think there's going to be very different experiences of girlhood and womanhood, and
Well,
even
I think there already is in a lot of cases. I mean, you have an older generation where there were so few people who actually could come out young, so that they didn't necessarily experience girlhood, or they didn't have their girlhoods recognized as girlhoods by other people, which, right, is a different experience, even if they were aware of it. And in that case, it's not. I mean, I was really surprised because I was talking to a trans woman I know recently about Janet Mock, talking about, that she when they put the caption under her, that kind of famous incident, born a boy or whatever it was that they put under her speaking self, and how she got angry about that. And I said, well, it's kind of a new paradigm, this idea, right, that someone like Janet Mock was never a boy. Like, this is a whole new idea that trans people are trying to get across, and I think it's awesome. But it's certainly going to confuse people who learn the boy, the whole transition narrative, which is that this person was male up until this point, and then they changed everything, which is kind of what the narrative has been for years. And now
yeah.
all of a sudden that's not the narrative, and we're going changing. Anyway, so I know that part is confusing, but I was very surprised to hear a trans woman friend of mine go, I have to acknowledge that I was born and assigned male at birth because my transition was a big deal. And if I just tell people that I was always a girl, then then this whole thing didn't happen. Then transition doesn't have the manifestation, doesn't have the repercussions that it does. And for her, that was really important. She lost friends, she gained friends, she, had a whole bunch of experiences that were tied up in the process of coming out as trans and transitioning. So it was important for her in some ways to recognize having been assigned male at birth, precisely because she didn't want anyone to diminish her experience of her own transition, which is like awesome. But I get it too, in the sense that I don't think it's clear to people. Like, I was reading a lot of comments right under the photo, the specific version of that statement that I found, and
Yeah.
it was upsetting, right, to see all of the people who are basically like, right, women born women and trans women aren't born that way. So, there was a lot of that. I feel like it gave enough fire to people who want it to still be exclusionary, at least of trans women's experiences, that they should be welcome at the festival, but not necessarily, but with the focus still on people basically, right, declared female at birth and born with vaginas.
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting because I've watched the controversy sort of evolve over the last 7 years, especially.
Mm-hmm.
That's sort of when I sort of noticed a change, a little shift was probably about 7 years ago at festival, and I'm not even sure why it was 7 years ago, but that's when I sort of remember it sort of coming to a head. And I remember there was a peaceful group at the festival, Trans Women Belong Here, starting to do some activism at the festival. There were trans women in that group at the festival.
Right.
Trans women were coming in and saying at the gates, I'm a trans woman and I'd like to buy a ticket, and they were being sold a ticket and let into the festival. And I remember that, and I remember thinking, okay, we're headed in this direction. Like, this is the direction we're headed in, and if we just sort of go in that direction, it's not going to be a big deal. And, some women are going to feel uncomfortable, but I think it's just going to sort of be this slow shift, and these conversations are going to happen, and we'll figure out how to make safe space for trans women within the festival to convene amongst themselves. Similarly, we have other tents at the festival that are specific to certain groups of women. So I thought, like, oh, someday there'll be a trans women tent, like,
Like
and
like the
that'll be like,
caucuses at normal
yeah.
at like the other conferences. Okay,
Yes,
that's
yes, very
cool.
much like that. So I was like, oh, and so I think it was almost naive of me, but again, this was sort of before social media was a huge deal too, when this all started. And I feel as though social media has really, really wrecked the sort of what I saw as a slow evolution towards change happening at the festival. I feel like social media just shot that all to hell. And frankly, I think some of the tactics have also harmed the evolution. I think that it's easy for women to feel resistant to boycotts and people saying they want the festival to die. That's very strong language, but it's language that's used a lot. Uh,
Right.
and I feel, I can't tell someone who's oppressed and feeling oppressed how they should end their oppression. I mean, that's just really not my role. But I wish, I wish that it had been more conversational. I wish that it had been less about boycott and more about that evolution that I saw happening, because I
Right.
think we were on the right track. And now there's just a lot of fear and a lot of mistrust happening. And then transphobia, really, coming back. And so I think that the transphobia that then is being thrown out only makes the people who are boycotting feel more certain about their boycotts, and so it's sort of like we're in this like constant fight place, as opposed to a place where we can listen to each other and take some of the fear and mistrust out of the conversation. Um,
Well, one of the things that I actually liked about the note was this whole idea of deep conversation, right? That we can't necessarily agree on everything. Feminist communities in particular, right, have always disagreed about everything, whether it's
oh my
porn
God.
or, I mean, these are, and a lot of them are unresolved arguments. I mean, I think sex work now, right, is another one that's kind of becoming a bigger issue. But the idea though of being able to maintain conversation as opposed to I have an opinion, I'm right, you're right, and that's I think exactly what social media exacerbates is that kind of not only that, but of course people find information and articles that were written 10 years ago. And of course, if things have changed, they don't necessarily know that. That was the other part of that I thought was really useful too, was to get your facts straight, actually know what the policy is right now.
Yeah.
Um, and it's certainly not a perfect policy even now, but it's certainly better than it was.
Right. And the apology to the trans woman that was thrown out 20 years ago, I thought that that was powerful and meaningful as well. Because I hadn't heard that apology in the past, as clear as that, where we kicked this trans woman out, that was wrong, we apologize. It has not happened since. I
Well,
thought that
and
that
the
was really,
trans women are women and sisters was as equally powerful to me, both the apology and that kind of affirmation spoken out loud or written out loud, whatever you want to say, but put in print.
yeah. Yeah, it was powerful. And I will say that at festival when these discussions are happening,
Mm.
they're so different than when they're I wish that we could figure out a way to have these discussions outside of the festival so more trans women could join the conversation and more
Right.
women in general could join the conversation, because I think that that's missing, and I think that it's wrong to just have these conversations happen on the land, because it doesn't feel safe for a lot of trans women to attend, even though we're saying we're sorry we kicked out this trans woman 20 years ago. No one else has been turned away. I can still see how someone is like, yeah, I'm not coming there, especially when they read the comments by people who don't support inclusion. That's really upsetting. And I was literally moved to tears by the article written in Huffington Post by Kaylee, I think is how she pronounces her name, who
Mm-hmm.
talked about her experience being at the festival, and she camped in the area that my partner and I camp in, the Twilight Zone, and talked about being met with nothing but acceptance. I mean, that really did. I cried when I was reading it, and I was so thankful that she had had a positive experience, because that the people I camp with, that's what we want. We want inclusion, and we want people to have positive experiences, and we want more people to experience the festival. We don't want it to die. So it's interesting to have these conversations though on the land, because I will have gotten into a vehement argument with someone on Facebook, and then I'm having this conversation with her on the land, and we have to make eye contact and listen to one another, and it's so
Yes.
much gentler. It's so much gentler than it is over Facebook, and it's really disheartening that that's like our main form of communication about this issue. So I would love to see a way to have some of these allies and understanding workshops outside of festival in communities.
I think that's a great idea. I mean, I think one of the things that happens too is that not enough I mean, the arguments for trans inclusion, I feel like there's this automatic assumption that the burden of making that argument is for trans women to make. I mean, I find a lot of trans feminist stuff tends to be that way, that it's like there's no expectation that there would actually be cis feminists who would want to make the argument for trans inclusion. You know, that becomes an automatic, you're one of them, you're on their side, you already have an opinion kind of things. And it's like, okay, I've spent like 10 plus years asking all of the same questions about gender essentialism, what makes a woman, and like this is not new to me. I've asked all the same questions, but the idea that, you know, as someone who's come around and said, no, okay, I get it now. I'm a stubborn person, generally speaking, and I don't like to be told what to believe. It's just not, you know, my gig. And like most of us, it isn't. But I feel like I've asked all of these questions over the years and kind of come to the conclusion. It's like, no, trans women are women. Let's move on. And so I feel like there's a level of impatience, at least for someone like me, precisely because I don't understand what the problem is still. You know, and I've known and obviously interacted with women who are born trans for years now, and it astonishes me when I hear that kind of transphobic stuff, or I hear, I mean, you know, her public name is still Betty, but yeah, like when she's been regendered by feminists, I have to put that in giant scare quotes because the idea that somebody would out me and her based on the idea that, you know, somehow being pro-trans makes us not feminist. I mean, all of this stuff has been so complicated, but I just don't, I mean, so where do you think the resistance still is in really actually just kind of going, okay, we're done, like, trans women are included, let's move on. That's it. That's the end of the conversation. No more talking about it or explaining the policy, just trans women are included, you're welcome, please come, done. Like, when is that going to happen? And why do you think there's still a resistance to doing that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, honestly, I think that the boycotts, the response to the boycotts has been to dig their heels in and get even more territorial about the space and more resistant. And that's sad. For me, the boycotts, I don't agree with them. They upset me, but it doesn't change where I'm at because, you know, like you, I've had so many experiences with trans women, especially in the last decade, but I have to remember that for a lot of these women, they haven't had any experiences with any trans women, and that's sort of part of it. So if I were running the campaign for inclusion, I would want to take like the stories of real trans women and real trans girls to the festival in some sort of way and say, hey, look at this story from this trans woman, read this story from this trans girl, like, this is what we're talking about here, and how do you feel, like, sort of like we did with marriage, where we were like, look, this is a couple that wants to get married. How can you deny that they love each other and want to get married? You know, like if you're listening to a trans woman tell her story, how can you deny that she's a woman and that she deserves to share this space with you? And I thought that was happening with Trans Women Belong Here. That was their approach. And it was the approach of the trans women that were part of Trans Women Belong Here. And I wish that the decision just had happened like 4 years ago before it could blow up on social media, because I feel like now there's lots of women who have come out so strong against inclusion that it's hard to back down from that position. It's hard. Yeah. You know, I worked with a Republican during the marriage campaign here in Maine who had voted against us in 2009. And it was so hard for him to come out and say, I'm actually supporting the freedom to marry now. And the reaction that he got, you know, from his own community was challenging, but he did it. But I feel like for these women to sort of have to go back and say, I was wrong, is really hard. So I have compassion for them, but I'd like them to get there. I'd like them to follow Lisa Vogel's lead and at least saying trans women are women, they're our sisters. Because that crap just, I mean, it just needs to stop. It just needs to stop. And it's so disheartening. And I can't stomach it. I just, you know, I just sort of gently chime in on all of those Facebook threads and say, hey, regardless of how we feel about inclusion, let's not misgender people. And sometimes I think do you have to go home and live in an LGBT community? Because I do. So I can't imagine like
Right.
what sort of vacuum these women exist in where they don't have to go home and somehow participate in a bigger community that includes trans women.
Right.
Um, for some of
There's
them, that
a
might
lot
be.
of places, I think, where trans women are reluctant to join in LGBTQ, everything but the T community, precisely because they don't feel welcome yet. So, the trans sphere still kind of feels like it's its own space to some degree, at least to me. It doesn't mean I mean, all the trans people I know too. I mean, and I can't say that I only know this tiny subsection, right? Because I've met thousands of people over the years, and it's very rare to meet somebody who's not sort of pro-ally, who doesn't want to see lesbians and gay men sort of come to trans events and learn what they want to. It's like it seems to me the most open community in a lot of ways, precisely because people acknowledge the fact that people don't understand the experience, they don't know anything about it. They want to create spaces that are educational for people. I mean, just the sheer number of trans people who show up at, human psych courses and to talk about this stuff, like it's an ongoing educational campaign. That's what has been going on for so many years. And so it kind of amazes me when you've got people who I think of as otherwise, it's the usual disappointment, people who otherwise understand oppression based on gender and yet have become, they just won't listen to the experience of trans women or experience them as women. And I don't feel like it's that hard to do, but maybe it does take meeting enough people, reading enough stories. It means being invested in saying, okay, I have to find a way to do this, even though there's something that I've been taught that's preventing me from getting it. Does that make any sense?
It does. It does. And I mean, again, I can't tell someone not to boycott the festival, but I wish that the boycotts hadn't started. I wish that they hadn't come to such a head because I think it was hard then for women to be open to listening, sort of, all those educational things that happen, all those speakers bureaus, all those workshops, all the, like we did like a how to be a trans ally workshop at the start of our Pride planning this year in Portland. And it was
Right.
so incredible and powerful and helpful to people in the room who hadn't really thought about trans issues or how to be inclusive of trans people in our Pride planning. And I think like, oh, like that's so great. And, I think that if more, like I said, if more of the Trans Women Belong Here work had just sort of continued to happen and ramp up, we'd be in a different place than we are now. I really believe that. So I don't know how we can just tell people, like, I mean, again, though, even though the boycotts happen, it hasn't changed how I feel about inclusion. So people do need to sort of let go of that anger and resentment that they feel about the boycotts and try to sort of get to a place where they can actively listen again and be open to understanding. But it's hard because they're angry.
I think the boycotts too came about right because people felt so frustrated. I mean, I feel like there's a whole other sub-issue I'm going to leave alone, which is whether or not boycotts are a good idea, intra-community, blah, blah, blah. Leave
Right.
all that aside. But the idea of whether or not, why people felt the urge to kind of ramp things up, why there was this, okay, talking doesn't seem to be working, articles being written, all of the conversations that were being had didn't seem to be changing the policy or bringing this kind of clear
Yeah.
statement, right? Trans women are women and are welcome, just end of that, that's over.
That's it.
Didn't seem to be happening. So did the Trans Women Belong Here campaign, do you feel like it kind of went away as a result of the boycotts?
I did. And what's interesting to me is that the biggest and most successful boycotts of the festival were started by women who have never been and who have expressed a desire to never go. So that felt problematic to me, that the boycott was being started by someone who hadn't gone. And so for people in that group to say trans women belong here and the discussions aren't working, I was sort of like, how do you know that that's not working? Because from my perspective, being at the festival and being part of those conversations, they were working. And so
Right.
it was challenging to be told by sort of an outside group who hadn't been there at the festival that this was now the tactic that we needed to use. We needed to boycott because other things weren't working. That was challenging for me. But again, I can't tell people not to do it. I mean, it's not my
Right.
place. Um,
Well, the
and
whole, I think too, it
the
was it's
argument.
not working fast enough, maybe
Right.
too. Not that it wasn't working altogether, but it certainly wasn't working
Well,
fast
it
enough.
wasn't working fast enough. Yeah. Nothing within the feminist movement works fast enough, in my experience. I
I can't
mean,
imagine what you're talking about. Yeah, no, of course not. I mean, it's always
like we've had a woman of color tent at the Michigan Women's Music Festival, and we've tried to do all of these things to sort of address racism at the festival. And guess what? We haven't solved that problem either. So,
well.
but there's sort of
Yeah,
this ongoing
America is currently being reminded, right, of exactly how big our racism problem is still, and it's just, I mean, obviously for the past couple of weeks, the news out of Ferguson is just like, okay, well, we've made no progress as far as I can tell.
yeah,
So,
60.
at least in some corners, yeah, I feel like in other places, I certainly know that when I talk to 18-year-olds, they seem to want to believe in a post-racial culture, and it's just like, that's awesome, but yeah, no. We're not in a post-sexist culture or post-trans, but like it's going to be a while, if ever. So I think the older I get, the more cynical perhaps I get as well. But yeah, things change, but they change very slowly. And the reality is there's always going to be people who hold out, people who are just not interested. No matter how amazing, if all of the U.S. right started doing anti-racist work tomorrow, in 10 years there would still be a group of people who like insist right on their racial views.
Yep.
So, and I think the same thing is true of transphobia. There are always going to be a handful of people who really are not going to make the leap, right, to get out of that kind of biological. And I know that's those are heard as fighting words within a rad femme community, but the idea, right, of essentializing, of saying, well, women born female or assigned female at birth have a different experience in some way that's so different, right? Because that's basically the argument. It's so different that that's not the focus of what we're doing here. And it's like, there's so many things that are left out of that, I guess is what I'm saying. So,
There really are. And I think that I can't imagine a trans woman that I know, any trans woman I know, coming to the festival and not wanting to make it about women's space. To try to make it about sort of some lived experience of having, if they think, at one point I was assigned male, I had a boyhood, and then I transitioned, if that's part of their story. I can't imagine them shouting that, from the roof. I think more trans women would come to this space to tap into the space, right? It's women's
right,
space. It's a lesbian culture. It is, and I think that it's important for people who come to the festival to know that it really is lesbian culture there. So my assumption is that probably lesbian trans women would come to the festival and they'd want to be lesbian trans women while they were there. I mean, I can't I can't imagine the dialogue changing. And
right,
for me, it's such an opportunity to tap into my womanhood that week while I'm there. So that's what I think the trans women who would come would want as
right.
well. So I don't feel any fear about that. And
The idea, right. Go ahead. Sorry, finish.
no, it's just it's just baffling to me, and I think I can't say that some trans women wouldn't want to talk about their childhood experiences, and there's also sort of this fear of just the presence of different bodies on the land, bodies that look different.
Right,
And there's sort of always that argument too, that real fear. Again, I can't imagine a trans woman, you know, being aggressive with her body. I can't imagine that. I don't observe, I don't experience trans women as aggressive, so I can't, that's unfathomable to me. And I think some people are more comfortable with the nudity at festival than others, so it's hard to say.
right.
I'm not nude when I'm there, so I mean, like this is not my thing. But I don't know,
Right.
and I wouldn't want to differently police trans women on the land around those things than I would any other person who attends. So that's
Which
important.
I find it, I mean, one of the things that I know trans women often point out is that and having been around maybe more naked trans people than the average person, the idea that this is a sort of representation, your whole symbolic phallic thing, and it's just like, oh wow, like you've obviously never actually seen a penis that's been on estrogen for 3 years, even a year, dramatic difference. And in some ways, I know, obviously, in the trans community, the whole let's not talk about genitals, we're not defined by our genitals, and absolutely, but when you're bringing up issues of nudity in women's space, like this is going to be an issue. And I kind of wish more people would realize that these are not men's bodies. Trans women do not have men's bodies. And of course, trans men do and are also welcome at the festival. So it gets this whole complexity of how do we think about bodies and how do we think about nudity? How do we create safe spaces? And in some ways, I look at sometimes sex communities as doing the same thing, right? How do you create safe space when you've got a lot of different kinds of people? I mean, for me, right, the festival is something that I don't like camping, I don't like nudity. I'm like one of those people who just, I can't imagine being comfortable there. And
Right.
so the idea, right, of people who don't want to go in the first place, for us at least, was like, I could see enjoying it from a very political perspective, but the no shower, no, my joke is that camping is, we wouldn't have invented houses if camping were good enough, so that's my universe. But the very, very urban kid all along. But the sense of sort of who gets included or why they'd want to be included, especially if they don't want to come in the first place. And I know, obviously, there's a whole, even if I don't want to golf, I should be allowed to join the men's golf thing, right? Because that's what we've been doing for years, is kind of breaking down these walls. Even if you don't want to belong, you should have the right to go.
That's absolutely right.
And feel safe. I mean, if that's what the whole idea is. So I still feel like it's this sense of, there's a part of me that says it would be easy to do, or feel like idealistically that it would be easy to just say, this is the deal, trans women are welcome, they should be safe here, like, end of story. Like, we'll do more stuff here to keep people, educate people if they're feeling uncomfortable. But the argument is always made, well, I don't feel safe now that there are trans women here. So how do you respond to that disagreement?
I like to respond to that disagreement in person, because I feel like it goes way better than it does on Facebook. But
Yeah.
I ask what the fear is. I say, can you articulate your fear to me? I really want to understand it. And then I try to sort of share my experience and my sense of myself and my womanhood as it relates to trans women and their womanhood. And I just like to have the conversation, because once you sort of dive a little deeper and ask, like, well, why are you fearful? It's sort of like in the marriage equality work that I've done, it's like, what does marriage mean to you? Okay, what do you think it means to a lesbian couple or a gay couple? Like, what do you think marriage means to them? Can you fathom a place where marriage might mean similar things to them than it does to you? And so I sort of use that tactic and say, can you imagine that a trans woman might experience her womanhood in ways that are very similar to how you experience your womanhood? Can you imagine wanting to be a woman? I can't. I mean, if I weren't a woman, I'd want to be a woman. I love being a woman. I think it's like the best thing ever. So
That's awesome. Yes.
I try to make that joke too. Like, I think, like, man, I would really want to be a woman if I weren't born.
You would want to transition, right? If all of a sudden you found yourself, and yeah, and I've always joked that I'm not sure that I would notice necessarily. So it'd be like different set of problems, but I'd still have gender issues. So for me, it would kind of be a 6 of one, half dozen of the other issue. But feeling like, too, I'm someone who's identified as gender neutral, despite the fact that I know my presentation is variable, right? My one consistent thing is that my gender expression certainly changes over time, and has my entire life. Like, it still will not stay in one place no matter what I do. But the sense that that's kind of a normal experience, I think, too. And I should say, too, thank you, and I think I've said this before, but the idea of actually hearing people say, well, I'm really happy to be a woman and I would want to transition if I weren't one, too, I think gives that whole argument of, like, people don't value womanness. I mean, it points out the idea that trans women, how could they dare to or want to or whatever. Why would anyone ever aspire to being a woman or being feminine or some combination of those things? You know, it's a really nice feminist reminder, especially for people like me. Because I can't, you know, my joke was always that the idea of being in women-only space was enough to give me hives. I need a lot of gender around because otherwise my gender doesn't feel right unless it's in a really, really very inclusive space in terms of all genders. But
Yeah,
it's
no, I love the week that I spend at Michigan every year. It renews me, it fuels me. But when I get back, I'm so reminded by the men in my life and how awesome they are and how much I need them. You know, I'm very lucky. I have a great dad. I have gay male friends that are incredible feminists and just incredible men in general. And so, you know, it's sort of like when I get home, I'm like, oh, it's so nice to be like with my boys again because I love them and I need them in my life. So, you know, but I think it would be so radical if the women who are so afraid of inclusion could sort of come to this understanding, like, don't you understand? Like these trans women, they want it bad. Like they want to be women. Like they want it bad. Like and try to understand the oppression that they have gone through and the hurdles that they have had to jump and you know, not everyone is Laverne Cox or Janet Mock. You know, like there's been some serious, you know, serious warriors in the trans women community, serious warriors, and
yeah,
Amazons. You know,
yeah,
like at that festival, we refer to ourselves as Amazon women, and I can't think of anyone that more exemplifies that name than trans women. You
right.
know, just wanting it so bad and fighting for it and saying, nope, this is who I am and this is how I identify. I mean, I think that could powerfully change the festival in a good way. I don't think it would take over by any means because regardless of what happens,
And
trans
for
women would
some,
still be a minority at the festival. I mean, women of color are still a minority at the festival. You know, working class women are still a minority at the festival. Disabled women are still a minority. Deaf women are still a minority. I mean, you, we would still sort of have this minority population, but they'd add to the culture there, and that's you know, it's made us better. It's made us better. All the groups that have come in and demanded that the festival become more inclusive of their needs, it's made us stronger and it's made us better. And
right.
I would welcome that change. And I don't know. I want it to be clear. I feel like this statement was closer, but still not there. I need like a real clear statement. But until then, I don't know. I'm really
It's one of those classic bad apologies in some ways. I mean, and I think the apology itself was heartfelt and direct, but then there's so much like, but then there's all this stuff you have to consider and why, you know, things haven't changed. And it's like, oh, don't do that. I mean, once I saw there were like however many points there were, 7 points, it was like, oh, that's not good news. Because if you have something to say like, I'm sorry and now trans women are included, right, that's 2 sentences and you're done. So if there's going to be 7 paragraphs, it's kind of a message right away that it's like, oh, you're going to try to explain yourself, and there's really no point in doing that really at this point. I get the idea, and there were parts of it actually later on that I did find particularly useful. Like I said, the sense of, but even pointing out, oh, there were all of these deaf women. It's like we're not looking for anybody's credentials as to how diverse they are necessarily. That's not really the concern. That's really a side issue, whether or not the festival is actually inclusive in 18 other ways. The problem is trans women, right? That's
like
the one that's really kind of become the biggest problem lately, so, or has been a problem for a long time, and that's specifically one that needs to get fixed. But anyway, but so it was useful reading in a lot of ways, but it was also, like I said, that feeling of like the kind of classic bad apology. I'm going to apologize and then I'm going to explain why you shouldn't hate me for having made this bad decision, right? Or
right. I'm
why.
not going to change my behavior. Yeah.
Well, or I'm going to change my behavior, but I'm not changing my beliefs, which I think is kind of more the tone or the tenor of this one, which is,
Yeah.
um, trans women are women, just in some way categorically not our focus, and so not somehow not important. I mean, a part of me goes, where's the like do the year of the trans? Like that would be awesome. To be inclusive, to have a year, like really announce, like no, really welcome. We're going to focus on trans issues for a year, but I can't even imagine what kind of controversy even suggesting that would cause. I'm sure it's been made as well. But yeah, I mean, for me too, it's my feminism in itself and working with trans women has been so hugely expanded because it really was a dilemma for me to look at my husband and go, really, really, you're going to do this to live in the world as a woman? Like, okay, you know, like as a feminist, I find that irrational, but go ahead. You know, I mean, this is the sort of the idea that we, and it's taught me so much as a result, right, of the idea, even talking to trans women about femininity and about doing what you need to do for yourself. I can't think of anything that's kind of a more feminist impulse in a lot of ways, right, than figuring out a way to be who you are and be respected for who you are in the world, despite your gender, whatever your gender is. And yeah, for me, it's always been a community that's always been consistently feminist to me. Or the impulse to me, the theory and the ideas seem so related and so interconnected that it's in some ways I think almost difficult for me to understand where the lack of why it's not kind of working together, because I see them as so part and parcel of the same movement. And so this idea of going, no, we're going to separate these people over here is just kind of baffling in some way to me. So.
Yeah, and I think it's problematic when it's not crystal clear that trans women are invited and welcome. It's problematic because if I can't speak to this, but I can totally understand when a trans woman says I'm not going there until like I'm safe and I'm welcome. It's sort of like I'm not joining the military until I know I can join the military and be married to this woman. I wouldn't join the but I think it there's lots of safety issues emotionally involved in that, and so it needs to be crystal clear. And I'm not, like I said, I mean, I think the statement was closer, and I think it's good that there has been some change in terms of not policing gender and not kicking trans women out of the festival, but that's not the same as saying, come here, you're welcome to join us. And saying you're women, but not quite is not the same as saying, you're women born women too, if that's how you identify. And it's interesting enough to sort of recognize how many trans men attend the festival and work on the crew, because that is something that I actually do struggle with. And I love the trans men in my life and in my community, but I don't agree with their attendance at festival. I really think it's women's space, and it's challenging for me when individuals come who live as men in the world come to the festival, because that's what bugs me. I'd camp next to, shower next to, hang out with a trans woman all week, and I keep my distance from the trans men that are there.
Interesting. Yeah, but I think that's also too. But hanging out in trans community, you really stop. I mean, that's the whole issue. Is to me sometimes experiential, and being willing to kind of experience trans people as they are. Is that unless you've hung out with trans men, it's very easy to think, oh well, they were socialized female, and so they're going to be, or especially if they came up lesbians, and it's like, until you're talking to a trans guy who's just telling misogynist joke after misogynist joke, it's like, no. I mean, there are cool guys, there are feminist guys who are trans guys, and there are total assholes who are trans guys. Like, the whole idea that being trans kind of comes with this set of assumptions about how cool you are as a feminist or what you think about women. It's like, no, there's the same variable as in the rest of the world.
Yeah, I wish it were that simple. I wish all trans men were hardcore feminists who respected women and were amazing partners and full equality in their relationships. I mean, that'd be amazing if we could just create a whole generation of men like that. But no, it doesn't work that way. You have to sort of pick and choose what you're going to take from male privilege and what you're going to leave behind. I think, it's interesting because my wife said a couple years ago, she was like, you know who I don't want to go to festival with? Assholes. And she's
Yeah,
like,
but
it's so
how do you do that, right? How do you make sure there are no assholes? That's very difficult.
like, and someone actually said today in one of the arguments that was happening on Facebook, she asked a woman, she said, have you had a good experience with every woman-born woman at festival that you've interacted with? Because there's no way. So, stupid arguments happen at festival, like your spoon touched your plate, the spoon from the food dish touched your plate in the line, and you've done it the wrong way, or you're not supposed to be walking there, or you can't get off the tractor until it fully stops at this location. I mean, there's like all of these dumb fights that happen all week, and women who are just sort of like, ooh, I'm wearing an orange vest, so I'm in charge. What does that feel like? I've never had power. So,
That never goes well.
no. So, I mean, I think one thing that I know is that I want to figure out how we can have these allies and understanding workshops outside of the festival during the year. That's one thing that I know. I don't know how to solve the problem. I don't
Right.
know how to change hearts and minds of women who attend the festival. I don't know what it's going to take for the festival to be able to continue and to become inclusive. I don't have any of those answers. I'm committed to finding them. But the one thing that I feel really committed to is figuring out how to have the allies and understanding workshops outside of the festival throughout the year.
Yeah,
And
I mean, it's what's tricky too is that I mean, as well as a feminist, like I don't necessarily want to spend all my time educating my fellow feminists on trans issues.
no,
And there's a bunch of stuff I don't get to work on otherwise, but I feel like it's a responsibility for those of us who are paying attention and who know something about trans culture to be active allies and actually do some of the work so that it's not all the burden of trans women all the time, because certainly you can see the frustration levels going on there. It's exhausting.
well, it's interesting to me too to think about, would I be invested in this conversation about the Michigan Women's Music Festival if it weren't so important to me personally? Because I think in terms of LGBT issues that I want to spend my time and resources on,
Right.
this isn't it.
Right.
Like a vacation that happens for mostly middle-class white lesbian women in the woods of Michigan is not where I want to spend my time and my activism.
Yeah.
I'm committed to it because it's important to me, and it's important to me that the space that's so important to me is not hateful or hurtful. So that's why I want to do this work, but I can totally hear. I felt very frustrated when Equality Michigan came out with a boycott because Michigan doesn't even have basic protections for LGBT people. You can get fired from a job for being gay in Michigan. And so
Right.
the fact that Equality Michigan is going to spend a minute on this is so frustrating to me. I mean, put out a statement, say that the festival should be inclusive of trans women, and that you condemn the fact that it's not. Absolutely, totally appropriate. I
Sure.
don't think it's appropriate for Equality Michigan to be spending all this time and energy on a boycott, organizing a boycott. That just seems crazy to me when you could get kicked out of a restaurant that you're eating in for being there with your partner in Michigan. Perfectly legal.
Sure.
Um, it's like bigger fish to fry, equality organizations. But for me personally, am I going to work on this issue? Yes. I think trans women who want inclusion, want to attend the festival, I can see why they would want to work on this. And that's my hope. But God, as a movement, I think we need to spend as little time on this as possible.
And that was the other piece I think of the statement that I found really interesting was the sort of anti-corporate, like there's a lot of LGBT people who fully embrace, right, certain kinds of policies and politics and organizations that are not necessarily good for our communities, depending on your perspective. And there's that kind of bigger fish to fry issue as well. I mean, that's, I think, a kind of tactical conversation, but I agree with you. It's like I think they're it's one of the reasons too why, for the same reasons that are given, right, for people who don't want to work on marriage, which is we've got non-discrimination stuff to pass, and all of those things. And I do feel like there's room to kind of work on everything. But in terms of my own personal thing, it does kind of go, okay, well, if you're a pro-trans ally and pro-trans feminist, trans-inclusive feminist, it just becomes like this is the conversation I have over and over again with feminist friends. Lesbians, not lesbians, doesn't really matter. It's still like this, and I keep having this dream, right, of that perfect argument you can make where you just go, okay, trans women and women, can we move on? Trust me, believe me, I've asked all the questions, I've read everything. At what point do people who haven't studied or researched any of this stuff go, okay, I don't know anything about that, but I can trust another woman who's a feminist to actually go, oh yeah, okay, maybe I don't have to ask all of these questions myself. Maybe occasionally we can trust other people who've gone through the same process instead. And I feel like we do that to some degree, and as feminists, I think we've done that over and over again as well. You don't go reinventing the wheel every single minute. And that's exactly, I think, was frustrating about sort of the marriage arguments, was how do you explain to people that this isn't, first of all, it's not about sex, and secondly, right, it's all of the other issues that come about. I know we're in one of the states, right, that we don't have, we don't have a statewide non-discrimination clause, and we don't have a lot of inclusion yet. So getting there.
One of the states where you probably be able to get married before you can openly work a job and not feel afraid to get fired. You know, like it's sort of like when marriage was when the ban was overturned in Michigan, there was sort of that window. I was like, Michigan, the state where you can marry your partner but still get fired from a job for being gay. You know, like it's like, I live in Maine, so, you know, I think we're perfect and right in every way that we've done things. Mostly because we included trans people in our statewide non-discrimination act when we took that to the legislature and we took it to the ballot. We just included trans people and we didn't back down. And something that was so fascinating to me about the HRC coming out against the Michigan Women's Music Festival. I said on Facebook, I said, oh, good, the first thing that the HRC is going to do for trans people is boycott a vacation. You know, like that's
well, middle class white people's issues again. There's that. Yeah, no, it's funny. I think that one of the only states, I'm in Wisconsin, right, which is one of the only states that gets kind of a little bit of a pass for not including gender identity and expression because they passed their sexual orientation non-discrimination so long ago. It's from 1986, I think it was the first one in the country passed. So it's like, okay, so there's a little bit of a pass there, but still it would be nice to get that to happen and included statewide. So yeah, and I think both of us could list the 8 million other things that activists, whether feminist, whether queer, whatever, could be spending our time and effort on. And it makes it even more important to go, when do we just get to put this behind us? When are we done? Yeah. A part of me goes, the conversations are probably useful.
Yeah. I'll be so happy when we're done. And then I know that we're still not going to be done, right? Because I think that even when we say, okay, there's inclusion, trans women are women-born women, come to the festival, there's going to be a ton of work still left to do, and that's the work that I'm excited for. So I feel like once we sort of get to that statement place, then it's going to be the job of women who attend festival, who are allies to trans women, to figure it out and figure out how to actually make it welcome and inclusive. You know, and unfortunately maybe to respond to some backlash at the festival if the policy changes. I mean, a lot of women who are afraid of inclusion, and I say afraid because I really think that's what it is, read Lisa Vogel's statement as the intention is changing. So they're convinced that she did say it very clearly that trans women are welcome. It's so funny. I'm like, oh, it wasn't clear at all. And these other women are like, it's so clear now. Trans women are coming. So that's an interesting difference in perspective yet again. So, you know, I think that I'm ready. I'm ready for this to be really clear and to change, and then I'm ready for the work that'll have to be done after that. You know, and that's
making space for all kinds of women again.
Yeah.
I think feminist community only gets bigger and better, right? The more inclusive we are. And so, I mean, in that sense, it's useful work because, the whole point. I mean, I think the thing that I go back to over and over again, though, is that, like, I don't know, as a feminist, like, having grown up with biology is not destiny, right, as a slogan, I'm never going to, that was the thing, right? And I don't know if that's as common or if it's less common now in feminist universes to even use that phrase. But it's like, how can we be defining this in this way when, women have been saying for a gazillion years that our bodies are not, what makes us women. So, I mean, they do and they don't, and they, all of the intersections of that. So,
Yeah, they do for some of us, they don't for others. I mean, yeah.
someone else's experience of their body and their gender may be different from your own, And a part of me goes, can we just move that along? It may not be the same. We may not have a universalizing experience, and let's just maybe get there. That would be awesome. But
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think for me, I feel so blessed that I'm now sharing my life with a woman who her gender and her body is totally different than mine, the way I experience mine. It's so fun for us, Like I always prepare people for her by saying, "Well, my wife is more like my lesbian husband, so get ready." So they're sort of prepared for her, and it's so interesting because I think that for the butch women who attend festival, it would be really interesting for them to have dialogue with trans women about, being perceived as masculine women in the world. Like, it's hard. I think being a masculine woman in this world is really, really challenging. And for trans women, whether, I think I've met trans women who identify as butch lesbians, so that's fantastic. More butch lesbians, please. But and then others who don't identify that way but are perceived as masculine women, and how challenging that is, and what an interesting dialogue that could be at the festival, and how could trans women help heal butch women and vice versa. Like, wouldn't that just be awesome? So, because the struggle is very similar, I think. We just don't have an opportunity to discuss it.
Well, it becomes the question of sort of how do you relate to a gender that people are maybe judging differently from the outside than from the people who are inside that gender. That's a whole conversation that I feel like, again, this is a feminist conversation that I thought we had many times over, but we're having it one more time. I found out recently that apparently when people find out that one of either me or my wife are trans, they often assume that I am the trans one. And so I've been having this kind of interesting, like, the first, and this was years ago, my first response was kind of, why would anyone think that? Like, and then I go, okay, so they're finding, my voice is deep or whatever. They're locating something about me that's masculine because that's what they decide. And I've always joked that the reality is my wife gets along better in the company of other women than I ever have. And so that sense of sort of feminism is so obvious to me, where I have always been, I feel like, on the fringes of women's culture and not particularly comfortable with it. And she's like, she thinks it's awesome. I mean, the more that in the world, the better. The more, women she can flirt with, the better. And I'm always like, okay, that's great for you. But yeah, so it's like the mixed bag of both simultaneously going, I'm the one who likes men's company. I know I'm not allowed to say that anymore, but but also certainly don't see my wife as one. I mean, as somebody who likes men, I feel like I can't say often enough, believe me, she's not a man. Like,
yeah.
It's so, and I think if you spend any time where you see somebody transition, maybe that's more apparent. But, believe it, the struggles that we've gone through because of transition would not have been half so significant if she were basically still a guy, right? I mean, this would be this would have been like, okay, no big deal, right, if this was still what I was doing.
Right.
But that's why there's been such a tremendous adjustment for me, is precisely because she isn't. And coming to recognize that and see it and value it and validate and all of those things.
Yeah, and And maybe that's what frames my experience at festival, where I'm challenged by the trans men who choose to attend, having had a trans partner, and witnessing his transition and really feeling like, oh, he's not a woman. Um,
Right.
like feeling that and experiencing that and seeing that change is probably what influences me being challenged at the festival with the trans men who choose to attend. And not even knowing what their gender experience is, it's probably just my own stuff, like saying that's not a woman. Like that person is a man, which isn't it's not mine to decide, but that's
Right.
how I know that it's my own stuff. I should probably go back to therapy to talk about that, but but I know that I'm much more
Oh,
challenged
that's
by
not
the presence,
irrational. Yeah. No, it's
right? But I know that I'm just,
yeah.
for me, like that's what I'm so challenged by at festivals. I'm challenged by the presence of trans men. I've never been challenged by the presence of trans women at festival. I've always been challenged by the presence of trans men.
But I find too that like feminists and queer activists who actually know more trans people, have had more interactions with trans people, are kind of easily kind of do that. It's not. It's there's no argument about somebody's gender once you have known trans women or you hang out with trans women. They don't vibe as not women, and so it's like this sense. I guess the sense that what I'm trying to get at is that I feel like people who are transphobic, especially if they're queer and feminist, it's because of a lack of exposure to
Yeah.
actual trans people. And
Yep.
I don't know how we fix that, especially if you're going to create spaces that aren't fully inclusive. But that's the only way to do it, is to go meet more trans people.
And it'd be interesting to
And
see, we were able to sort of host some of these allies and understanding workshops that happen at the festival in other communities around the United States, at least, and maybe some in Canada too. Would people come? How could we moderate it so it could be a safe and facilitated space? And then would women who go to the festival be exposed to more trans women for the first time ever in their lives, maybe? And how could that shift the discussion? I'm
right,
curious about it. I would want to be in every single one of those rooms. I would want to help facilitate them. I'd want to help make it a safe space. I was actually talking to a trans woman here in my community in Portland about that, and we're going to meet and talk about it and see what can be done. Because I really feel like if we had more exposure, it's sort of like with the gay marriage thing and with the
right,
non-discrimination law, and even it was interesting. Even with we've had this terrible trans bathroom bill that keeps popping up in Maine. Just every few years, like someone reintroduces it. It's this bill where you have to use the bathroom of your assigned birth sex, and it's so crazy. But we've been bringing trans people to the state house to testify and to lobby. And once people sort of meet these people, these trans people, they're like, oh, that bill makes no sense. Like that person should not be in the women's room, or that person
right.
should not be in the men's room. Why we don't just have gender neutral restrooms yet, I don't know.
Oh, that's a whole other, yes.
But especially
Yeah,
single
certainly. My wife, who was always willing to kind of stand in front of a room of people and go, ladies, do you really want her to use the men's room? And guys, do you really want her in your bathroom? And they'd be like, yeah, no. And it's like, okay, that's okay, done now. That's why trans people
Yep.
would get to, yeah, they get to decide what their gender is and what bathroom they should be in that's appropriate for them. It's not
Yeah.
hard.
Yeah, it's been an easy bill to defeat, even in a Republican-controlled legislature here in Maine the last time it came up. But
Sure.
it was about brave transgender people from Maine coming to the legislature and outing themselves and
Right.
advocating for against the bill, including one young woman who was 13 at the time, who's now 17, and she was our champion then. So that's about bravery, that I'll never understand. So it's hard for I want these allies and understanding workshops to happen outside of the festival, but I wouldn't blame trans people who don't want to come to those workshops. I mean, you're walking into like a minefield. So I don't know. I think it's a brilliant idea, but whether
Well,
it will
and I do
happen and
think
whether
it's
it'll work.
that's where the burden, or that's where being an ally. as much as, you know, being an ally to anything right now, I think is kind of a weird place. I'm writing about that elsewhere at the moment, just because I think allies are kind of not cool at the moment in so many ways. But as a cis trans ally, the idea, right, that I can go into a space that is not safe for trans people and make the argument for why it should be made into a safe space for trans people, because I'm not going to feel excluded, I'm not going to feel endangered just for being trans inclusive,
Right.
not in the same way a trans person is. And as much as I think that that's one of the places where I feel like trans inclusive cis feminists can actually make a difference, in we can put ourselves out there in a way that we're not going to be necessarily personally insulted by. I mean, we're, you know, there's still that like, ow, did you just say that out loud, or did you just really misgender somebody? Like, that's
Yeah.
so not cool. But it's not personal, right? And it's so, or it's personal, but it's not personal in the same way as it would be for a trans woman in the same space. So I feel like that's one of the places where we can kind of, yeah, make some kind of difference
I
at
think
least.
that's what we're doing inside the festival. I know that's what I'm doing. I know that's what other women who identify as trans allies are doing at the festival, because, you know, sometimes you get into an argument with someone there when you say, I support inclusion. But it's not unsafe. You know, it's not like anything's going to happen to me. I might lose a friend, but that's it. It's very safe for me at festival to talk about supporting inclusion. So, but I know that it doesn't feel safe for a lot of trans women to come to festival and have those conversations. So I'm trying to figure out a way to have those conversations outside of festival. Maybe they'll feel safer, maybe they won't, but maybe they'll feel a little safer than if we have them on that land only. Um, so that's my best proposal right now is that.
Right, keep up the good fight, basically. Yeah, try to at least include, sort of try to get more training or more education from outside, so that perhaps that changes policy eventually. In a
Yeah.
genuine, we're done and we don't have to discuss this anymore kind of way. Yeah, I was going to say the apology I think counts for a lot, but apology that doesn't then explain
Change.
itself for 5 paragraphs, yeah, would probably be the better version. So one of these days, I think we'll get there. But it was awesome talking to you. I feel like I've kind of taken up a bunch of your time, but
Oh no, I love talking about the festival, and like I said, I mean, I wouldn't spend as much time in this discussion if it weren't such a huge part of my life. But I'm happy to talk about it and to do whatever it takes to make sure the festival survives and that it changes.
well, I
Uh,
don't. One of the reasons I wanted to talk to you specifically is that when I talk to trans people, I think there's often a misunderstanding that there are any trans inclusive women who go to it, and it's like, of course there are. And so hearing you being able to kind of put this out there and go, no, 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 there are people who want to see this change, but they don't want to also throw out this very valuable event, and um, an event that's been life-changing and transformative, and, you know, obviously that's a cool thing. And instead of shutting it down, how do we expand, how
yeah.
to make that a cool thing for more kinds of people? Sounds like it would, yeah,
I
slowly.
think there's
That's
more of us. I think there's more of us than there. I think there's more people that support inclusion than people who don't, who attend
right.
the festival right now. And every year that number gets bigger. And for me, the area that I camp in, almost exclusively, every woman who camps there supports inclusion. So it's sort of this interesting bubble within the festival that I love. So
Yeah, but it sounds like that it does it very well. I mean, that there are always like bubbles of lots of different kinds of people and lots of different kinds of opinion
yeah.
of, you know, at least that unifying concept. So, and I can understand not wanting to see that concept or that focus diluted, but at the same time, how do you maintain the focus and just be inclusive? But anyway, but thank you for your time. I don't feel like I want to take up more of it, but, and at some
Well,
point I
thank
can
you.
edit this
Always
if it makes any sense. But
It's always good to talk with you, and thank you for the work that you do.
oh, likewise for you. It's so amazing that Facebook exists. As much as social media is a hack, it's also this amazing thing where I get to see sort of friends and peers and fellow activists and all this stuff, and basically keep up with people's stuff. And you've just been doing amazing stuff for years and years now. So
Fun. It's a
have a
good
good
thing about social media.
Yeah, that's the good part, is actually
Yeah.
being able to do that. It's the, if everyone could just be a little bit more civil and remember that you're talking to a person part of it that we don't always get right.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic.
Cool. Well, have a good night,
Thank you. You too.
and thanks. And I'll send you a copy or whatever, a link for this once it's
I'd love to
somewhere.
see what you come up with. I hope it's useful.
Great. Have a good one.
You too.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.